22nd of June 1976 Canary Island UFO event is one of the wildest UFO stories out there. I had no idea about it until I watched episode 10 of The Basement Office, which came out a couple of years ago. It was a mass sighting 46 years ago on a clear, starry night of strange lights in the sky seen over the Canary Islands over a wide area and probably by very many people. But the most sensational aspect of the story is that of a doctor and his taxi driver who claimed to have seen a transparent craft of some kind containing two tall figures dressed in red. Here's how it was described on the Basement Office episode.
And inside the orb, he sees two figures. And he wasn't alone. A couple from the window of their house, a teacher, a police officer, a farmer. They all see two figures inside this giant orb. And their descriptions of these entities all match up.
But the problem with this is that if you read the declassified Spanish government report, which you can download and read yourself, and you find the witness statements from the municipal police officer, B5, the farmer, B9, the couple, B1, and the teacher, B2, there's no mention in any of their statements of them seeing two figures. Here I've taken two maps from the Spanish government report, which are not that easy to read, and I've overlaid them on Gran Canaria Island in Google Earth, roughly matching up the coastline so that we have at least some idea of where each witness was and the distances between them. The couple, B1 in Boca Barranco, describe a light 3 times the size of the lunar disk that appears to be travelling towards them. But on the part of the questionnaire asking them to describe the object, they say no to question 7, which asks if there are other details of interest about what they saw. Their statement contains no description of figures or entities. The teacher, B2, was in the town of Agit, roughly 3 kilometers to the west, as the crow flies, of where the doctor and the taxi driver were. Looking west towards Tenerife, the teacher watches the light in the sky with binoculars and sees a large white transparent circle of light with 2 beams of equal thickness traversing it from the top to the bottom. But there's no description of 2 figures. The municipal police officer, B5, was 6 kilometers away from the doctor and the taxi driver on Galda Mountain, close to another witness, another taxi driver, not the one carrying the doctor. He sees what looks like a red object, like the tip of an arrow, but he makes no mention of 2 figures. And he also, on the other details of interest question, answers no. You'd think that seeing 2 red giants inside a sphere might get a look in here, especially coming from a police officer. The farmer, B9, was quite close to where the doctor and the taxi driver were, and described seeing a circular or parabolic light source with a stripe on the top of the dome. But again, there's no description of 2 figures. Of the 13 witness statements that make it into the official Spanish government report, there are only 3 who say they saw 2 figures: the doctor, his taxi driver, and a woman. The woman says she can't quite be sure of what she saw, and there's some doubt in the report about whether the taxi driver was influenced by the doctor, who was essentially his boss at that moment. Was it like someone saying, "Hey, that cloud looks like an elephant," and you, feeling obliged to be supportive or deferential, offer, "Yeah, an elephant in a tutu"? Could this be how the Swedish tourists remark occurred? The very next graphic in the Basement Office clip, I think, creates confusion by showing 3 pull quotes which you might be mistaken for thinking came from some of these witnesses in the previous graphic: the couple, the policeman, the farmer, or the teacher. But in fact, 2 of these quotes come from the taxi driver and 1 from the woman near the house that the doctor is traveling to, the same woman that says that she's not sure what she saw. Now, I'm basing these thoughts entirely on the Spanish government report as a primary source. I'm not aware of other interviews with these witnesses that might show that they all said that they saw 2 figures in the way that the doctor and the taxi driver did. But if the Basement Office is relying on just this report to say they all see 2 figures and their descriptions of these entities all match up, then I think they're mistaken because the report alone doesn't have any evidence to support this. I don't mean to pick on the Basement Office in particular, it's just that watching this episode was my introduction to this UFO story and it made me want to know more. I think they may have made more of the connection between the witness statements than the evidence supports. There are also others who claim that there are many more witnesses to the 2 figures in red suits, such as this YouTube video from Blue Room Media, which cites this very official-looking, unidentified flying objects briefing document, The Best Available Evidence. It was published in 1995, a year after the Spanish government declassified its reports. It's a book with an official-sounding title rather than a document, and the chapter on the Canary Islands event of the 22nd of June 1976 is a retelling entirely sourced from the Spanish government report and doesn't contain any new information. Yet this YouTuber claims that it shows that a grand total of 11 witnesses saw the 2 figures.
Okay, so this is what these people are witnessing. So you've got the taxi cab driver, you have the patient's son, you have the doctor in the taxi cab, so that's 3 eyewitnesses. And then there were two other eyewitnesses for a grand total of at least five. And then there were more than that. There were a grand total of 11 witnesses actually saw this transparent soap bubble with these 9 foot tall beings in it.
It also includes this annotated version of the illustration from the annex to the Spanish government report with a few added details. What's also fascinating about this story is that the doctor and the taxi driver say the object containing two figures was 15 to 20 meters in front of them and illuminated by the car headlights. Yet the third person in the car said that his view of the 25-meter wide by 20-meter tall object was obscured by the hood of the car. I've always found this strange. However, if we look at the route taken described by the doctor, they drove from the doctor's house in Guia, traveled 6 kilometers along the main highway between Las Palmas and Aguit, before turning left onto a local road that climbs uphill and ends in Las Rosas. I'm assuming this road hasn't changed much in 46 years and still looks like this one on Google Maps. We can see that the current Google Map road is roughly the same orientation as the diagram from the annex to the Spanish government report. The direction of travel for the doctor and the taxi driver here is roughly southwest, or the opposite direction to the lights that are being observed by the other witnesses, who are looking northwest towards Tenerife. Also, while on the highway before turning off onto the local road, their view northwest of Tenerife would have been obscured by mountains. I had thought this might be a problem for explaining the encounter, as it appears that they would be looking in the opposite direction to the other witnesses, who are all looking roughly west or northwest. Yet they describe seeing an object close to the ground containing two figures. However, if you follow this road off the highway, which is climbing up into the mountains, there's a very tight right-hand turn towards its end. The doctor says their encounter begins towards the end of this local road. This turn would have suddenly brought the car facing directly northwest towards Tenerife, matching the other witnesses' point of view. There are many assumptions here, but if this is correct, are all 13 witnesses in the report looking in the same direction and at the same thing, but just 3 of them are interpreting it in a wildly different way? Now, most of the other witnesses describe the light as close to the horizon. Estimates range from between 10 and 30 degrees. So if the taxi is on an incline at this point in their elevated position looking over Gran Canaria towards Tenerife, I wonder if the object close to the horizon was below the line of the car hood and so just out of sight of the person sitting a couple of feet behind in the rear of the car. This seems to support the idea that they had just made a sharp turn and are now looking northwest over the ocean. There have been some excellent articles written about what the likely explanation is for what most people witnessed from the Canary Islands on that evening. This 2001 article by Ballester Olmos and Campbell Perez revisits work they started in the early 1980s and makes a strong case for it being the launch of 2 Poseidon missiles from submarines positioned hundreds of kilometers to the west of the Canary Islands. In 1990, Manuel Borras in The Giants of Galder gives a great overview of the events of the 22nd of June 1976, but also how they fit in with other reports of UFOs around the Canary Islands produced by the Spanish government. And in 2015, former NASA space engineer James Olberg writes a presentation, Misperceiving Missiles, that includes some excellent images of far-distant multi-stage rockets producing otherworldly scenes, often with intense blues, very similar to what was described on the 22nd of June 1976. I'm not a rocket scientist, and you probably aren't either, so I recommend anyone interested in this case to read these articles in full. I've included links to them in the description below. The 22nd of June 1976 report is the second of 4 reports produced by the Spanish government that are now declassified. The reports use roughly the same methodology, coded questionnaires with open-ended sections, ranking of witness quality and reliability based on their occupation. They include meteorological reports, flight details from local airports, etc., and they all include a familiar proposal to establish an aerial phenomenon study center. What's interesting is how they all draw the same general conclusions, despite containing evidence and counter-arguments within them, such as this note from the 5th of March 1979 report from an Air Force general saying that he thinks that what was seen was Soviet weapons testing. The reports conclude with this: after analyzing this phenomenon, exhausting the possibilities of its cause, we have to seriously consider the need to accept the hypothesis that ships of unknown origin and driven by an unknown energy move freely through the skies of the Canary Islands. Here are some fun but probably very wrong theories. The lighthouse. The description of 2 figures inside a crystalline structure with a tall tower and some bluish smoke reminds me of the Fresnel lens of a lighthouse. These lenses are huge, large enough for 2 people to stand inside of or outside of on a balcony, and they create optical distortion. Older lighthouses were lit by acetylene, which can give a blue light. All lights under Spanish control are lighted a quarter of an hour after sunset. An hour after sunset in June could have been around 9:30 p.m., the time that two figures were seen. By some accounts, the two figures were seen operating levers, like they were controlling some kind of 18th century machinery rather than a spaceship. In fact, there was a lighthouse at Punta Sardina which could have been visible some 8 kilometers from the hillside of Las Rosas, exactly where the curve in the road is mentioned earlier. The light from its beacon had a visible range of 10 kilometers, seen represented here with the red circle. It's not this red and white one that's rendered on Google Earth. This one was first lit in 1985, but there was one that was built in 1891, slightly further inland and demolished in 1980. I think this is the remnants of it here. And this stock photo I found, labelled Galda Lighthouse, might actually be it. We know that the conditions on the night were exceptional. Could a lighthouse beacon project an image of its workers over that kind of distance? And did it have anything at all to do with the extraordinary testimony of the doctor? Soviet propaganda and Salyut 5. The taxi driver on Galda Mountain, not the one carrying the doctor, said someone said to him that what he thought he'd seen was a propaganda balloon. This was interesting. Who was making propaganda at the time? The Soviets. And coincidentally, a few hours before the Canary Island sightings, they had launched a manned mission to put Salyut 5, a military space station, into low Earth orbit from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, some 7,000 kilometers away. This launch, along with the suggested Poseidon missiles, make the 22nd of June 1976 a busy day in the upper atmosphere, and I wonder if propaganda had some bearing on the day's events. The general similarity between this 1960s toy Gagarin figure, the orange pumpkin suits of cosmonauts, and the general space fantasy propaganda aesthetic of the 1970s, where staff operated hulking silvery consoles, seem uncannily similar to the doctor's descriptions of what he saw. The Balul. Finally, perhaps the object close to the ground and some 15 to 20 meters in front of the doctor and the taxi driver was actually a very earthly object. I was reminded of the great scene in Jackie Chan's Operation Condor when he makes a daring escape down a mountainside inside of a giant inflatable ball. These were real things, invented by Gilles Ebersold in the early 1970s and designed to allow 1 or 2 people to throw themselves down a mountainside, all in the name of fun. Again, we have a crystalline sphere with 2 figures and a tall tower, the entryway to the inner ball, and yes, sometimes they were occupied by what looked like Swedish tourists in tight-fitting red diving suits. At the moment of them climbing the hill to Las Rosas, did the doctor and the taxi driver just happen upon some adventurous tourists testing this new kind of sport balloon? It has to be said that it seems entirely plausible that an event such as a missile launch, with a visible radius of hundreds of kilometers, could have been observed by someone somewhere who was simultaneously observing some other event or undergoing some other experience, whether it was a moment of extreme anxiety, a religious experience, drunkenness, having just watched a Soviet propaganda film, a lighthouse beacon being lit, or happening upon some sport adventurers about to launch themselves downhill through some onion fields in an inflatable ball.